Hank, where are you at the moment?
So I'm actually in Connecticut at Eric Gottesman's home. When after spending a month in quarantine, the first week of the crisis, Rue actually was bed stricken, and we later found out that she had the virus. Doesn't seem that I have. And our apartment's only three rooms. And my collaborator Eric Gottesman said he was going to visit his parents in New Hampshire, and I was like, oh, empty house in Connecticut. So we, with our baby, came up here, and have been here ever since. And our lease is about to run out in New York, so we have where do we go from here? I really don't know, with all of the dramatic change that's happened in the world over the past, week, even. It's really incredible.
The March 1st weekend, we did that picture that's in your background. We were all wearing the cloaks. I have mine here. And we were all wearing it, and you had organized with your collaborators that we were in front of the Geffen, and you had this drone, and we were all hugging. It was literally like a Simon Forti work, like huddle of like 500, 200 to, I don't know how many, it was 200 or 500. It was a lot of people, and we were all hugging.
Yeah.
And I remember that image, and that image stayed with me when we all went into isolation, because we did this gigantic group hug, and you videotaped it from above.
Yeah, I haven't seen that footage yet, but I can't wait.
So when you look back at the last 10, 12 weeks, Hank, you told us how you're in Connecticut now, you're staying at Eric's house with your family. Did you record time? Did you use it as a pause, or do you have a journal? How did you spend these last nearly 3 months now?
Well, it was almost like a second maternity or paternity leave. I didn't really necessarily have one when our daughter was born about a year ago. And right after, like about 10 weeks after she was born, Rue, my wife, Rue Jekyll Hockley, she went back to work because she was curating the Whitney Biennial. And so that was a pretty hectic time. And then I had a survey show and several other things happening. And the last big thing was the Congress. And it ended, and we went into quarantine, and my wife was, as I said, laid out. And then I wound up having to do a lot more with our daughter than either of us normally would, because we would share. And so then I spent most of the past 2 months just spending almost all of my time with her. And it was really great to actually watch all of the incremental growth. She learned to walk, she started speaking, and to be a part of those experiences with her was pretty awesome, especially as we became, increasingly aware of the value of each of our breath. And that was made obviously more kind of apparent in graphic, grotesque detail with the suffocation murder of George Floyd. So I've been went from like crazy, going way too fast, doing way too much, to doing, only the essentials. And it seems again, like in the past week, that we've gone back to 150 miles an hour when it comes to the radical change in discourse that's happening, and that's long overdue.
Yeah. So perhaps we should go into the slide projection. I think we have been working with each other now for more than a decade. But your work spans nearly 20 years now. When you, growing up, like your mother is an artist, Deborah Willis, she's a great photographer and curator, and so you grew up in a household where being an artist wasn't like kind of, that would be something one could do, right? That's kind of for several people who grow up in a household where this is not so close, it's different. when you were a child, did you know you wanted to also be an artist?
No, I was very, very much uh, unaware, frankly, of the idea of being an artist as a career until I remember in 1991 or 92, my mother brought me to the National Black Arts Festival in Atlanta, Georgia, with where Carrie Mae Weems and another artist, Christian Walker, and a lot of her other friends were exhibiting. And I think I was like as a teenager, I was like, wait, oh, you could actually, like, this is a thing that you really do? Because up until then, it was just life. Like, there was, all of my mom's friends were artists and curators and photographers, and that was just who they were. So I never thought about it as like a job. And uh, yeah.
When you are very fascinated, and I remember when we installed your first exhibition, you and I first worked on Unbranded, which was, I think, 2010 or so for Greater New York. And I remember we talked about it, and you talked about how you were fascinated about advertising and what advertising and photography. And you want to speak a bit about when this started? Was that something you were already intrigued by and fascinated by as a child?
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, I want to, before I forget. So yeah, and I move around in the chair a lot, so forgive me. Yeah, I started a project. This project that we're looking at currently is called Branded, and it was looking at the way in which Black bodies were commodified by major transnational corporations, and in some ways, thinking a lot about how slaves were branded as a sign of ownership, and now we brand ourselves, but often disproportionately Black bodies were disproportionately recognized in spaces where opportunity is given for are often the ones who are branded and selling the products and making them valuable. And I did a series of pieces thinking about really how I could use the language of advertising and popular culture to talk about things that advertising couldn't responsibly talk about. Because even if a major brand did, although as we see what's happening now with Nike and Adidas trying to speak to Black Lives Matter and other things, it's really complicated. And it's not to say that the individuals who work for these corporations can't speak from a sincere place. It does when there is, it's a corporation with finances as its bottom line, it always does become a more complicated situation. And so around 2005, I started to think about how fact might be better than fiction, and started to realize that looking at kind of real ads and seeing how they really do in many ways reflect and shape our society in a certain moment in time. And so I did a series called Unbranded Reflections in Black, 1968 to 2008. And I was looking at how advertising had transformed when it comes to focusing on Black audiences from the symbolic end of the civil rights movement when Martin Luther King and RFK were assassinated to 2008, which I just picked 2008 because it was 40 years, and not knowing that it would be bookended with the election of Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. And so in 2010, when you all did Greater New York and I was invited to show the entire series of, it was 2 ads for every year, so it was 82 images that I digitally removed all of the advertising information and to look at what's being sold, thinking a lot about Jeff Koons and Richard Prince's practice, among others. But when you were speaking, you reminded me that Ben Bronfman's on the phone, and you all introduced me to Sherry Bronfman, his mother, there. Yes. And she was like taking me through all the photographs. She's like, "Oh, that I knew that," because his mother was a model and actress in the 70s and 60s, and she's like, "Oh yeah, that's so and so. She's from so and so, blah blah." She knew all of these people in advertisements and could tell us all these stories. And little did I know that she knew my mom, and so Ben and I have become friends. And seeing this continuation of generations of connection, which is also pretty awesome.
You want to say a little bit more about this work? That was also the first work I know Amy Smith Stewart's a curator. She brought that on view in the museum where I was at the time, MoMA PS1. You want to say a bit more and then we move to the Absolute series?
Yeah, well, again, you asked me if I was affected by advertising. I think my generation was the first major generation where popular brands almost proved our value or shaped our value, meaning like, I don't believe people in the 60s had that many different brands of sneakers. You know, I know there's the Converse Chuck All-Stars, but by the time I was like 12 or 13 years old, people were being shot and mugged for Air Jordan sneakers because they were seen as more valuable than certain people's lives. And I just really was wanting to make that connection between branding as a concept in a corporate contemporary life and branding when it came to livestock and also human beings.
Yeah, we go to the next slide.
Yeah, and so this piece actually is part of a series of images and also my first sculpture, where I was really inspired by the Absolute advertising campaigns of the 80s, where they would take the iconic shape of, they took the shape of their bottle and made it iconic by making very representations of it with like all kinds of creative things like Central Park or, you know, San Marcos Square. They, with the pigeons, would all make the shape of the bottle. And I was looking at this 1787 illustration of the slave ship Brooks that showed how slaves were packed into ships as you know, livestock when they were kidnapped from Africa and shipped to the Caribbean and the United States. And I realized in 2003, I was in South Africa, and there was such incredible diversity in that one country of ethnicities of Blackness that it made me think exponentially about, you know, the huge continent of Africa, you know, and that it's this huge continent with hundreds of millions of people, with thousands of languages, thousands of religions, thousands of worldviews, and basically they were kidnapped, packaged in a ship, and sent to the United States and put under one brand, you know, Blackness. And I realized that Black people didn't create Blackness, that Europeans with a commercial interest in dehumanizing us created Blackness. And so race is the most powerful advertising campaign of all time. And the fact that someone could kidnap someone and, you know, ship them halfway across the world and tell them, kidnap all these different people and tell them they're all the same, and that 500 years later they would still be negotiating that language, that's absolute power. And also was thinking a lot about gun violence, where earlier this morning I was on a call with Moms Demand Action Against Gun Violence, because yesterday was National Gun Violence Awareness Day. And my current show at the Crystal Bridges Museum has a variation of a proposal for a national gun violence memorial, which I think is really important in the United States. On February 2nd, my cousin Sungha Thomas Willis in the year 2000 was murdered. And it changed the shape of my life forever, because my goal up until that point was to be his backup dancer. And he was shot and killed. And and my Aunt Leslie, who's an incredible spiritual, intellectual, everything leader for me, who helped me find all of the things for the Unbranded series, and, you know, helped me find my heart and courage in the way that she responded to the loss of her only son, um, yeah, um, we went to the site where he was killed, and I remember standing over this puddle of my cousin's blood, and it was really, it never left me. And I started, and I wanted to um, remind myself and everyone about what are the results of violence. And my cousin was killed because someone else wanted a gold chain that somebody that my cousin had seen that night was wearing. So they didn't even rob anything from him but his life. And so I was thinking about how our ancestors were brought here in chains, and then my cousin was killed because somebody wanted a chain, but not his or anything that it was just so complicated, and that death is absolute, and that we live in a society that says we don't condone gun violence, yet all of the things that we watch on television every day and movies is all about, glorifying violence, and mostly gun violence. And how could we ever have more than what we dream about? And I'm saying that as a self-critical thing because I love action movies and everything else. This is a picture of the Door of No Return in Goree Island. There's also one in Cape Coast in Ghana, where Larry is from. And I wanted to think about, absolute no return, when our ancestors left from these slave castles across the coast of West Africa into the sea, that they could never come back to truly to the cultures that they were leaving because of the effects of colonialism and various forms of misinformation and violation. And I wanted to point out before we move forward that my first sculpture was Absolute 187 for the victims of gun violence in Oakland and San Francisco in 2003. And that Dr. Joy Simmons, who's on the call, was my very first, the collector of my first sculpture. And Beth DeWoody, who's also on the call, was one of the first collectors of my work. And I believe she has Basketball Unchained, if not Branded Head. And I say that because that was 17 years ago that, I started making some of this work and being supported and continuing to be supported and growing with different generations of people invested in artists is really awesome. And I hope, and that's why I invited my friend Muna to be on the call, because I feel like it's important to keep passing information opportunities on to new generations and not forgetting those who gave you them. So thank you all for investing in me in such an early age. And this is a picture of my cousin Sunga's funeral, and my Aunt Leslie, who is also on the call, is there in the front with my Uncle Michael. And you can see other family members there as well at his funeral. And I remember us going to the funeral home when taking this picture. Actually, I was obviously at the funeral in February. That, I don't know, was it 6th or 7th after Sunga died, and he was 27 years old, and the church had a line outside the door, and people had come from California and Canada, from Florida and Virginia to say goodbye to this young person. And it's like, how could he wasn't famous, he wasn't rich. How could he have had such an incredible impact on people from so far away at such a young age? And his motto, and some of the last words he ever said that I heard recorded were love over rules, which is really grounded in the language our grandmother shared with us. But my Aunt Yvonne, who's also in the pictures and recently passed away, and my mom and my Aunt Leslie were in the funeral home, and they were like looking at caskets, because I didn't know that when someone dies, they're like, oh yeah, we have to get, do we have a good suit for him? Okay, we have to go get shoes. We have to go. There's all this weird pomp and circumstance about mourning. and they were in the funeral home, and there was like the $7,000 casket and the $5,000 casket and the $2,000 casket, and and none of them could we afford. And it was like, they're all going to be boxes of wood. They're going to be thrown in the dirt, never to be seen again. And do you love them more if you buy the $7,000 box of wood that's going to be thrown in the dirt, never to be seen again? Or maybe you couldn't afford to love them enough if you buy the 2,000. And it's yet another form, I think, of branding in our lives, and it took almost a decade just to get if not a decade, several years to get a headstone. And so this idea of at the time, MasterCard had their Priceless campaign, and it was all about these warm, fuzzy moments with family that were priceless. And I, really thought, the commodity that my cousin was killed over, the commodities that were bought to like make sure that he went out of the world looking good. They all were a result, I think, of branding and commodity culture, and that in a way that we're all owned by the MasterCard, and I was really kind of wanting to make a comment on that.
Mm-hmm. We go to the Unbranded series that you mentioned before, Hank.
Yeah. And so this is an image that my Aunt Leslie is an archivist, and at the time she was working at the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and she would often, growing up, every Black house had Ebony and Jet magazines as a way to share information about what was happening in parts of America where stories weren't being told, and if they weren't being told accurately. And really through Johnson Publications, different vehicles, the Negro Digest, etc., a picture was painted of Black America that no one else had really seen, and it was supported in large part by advertising, of course. And the first corporations to support, can we stay on that photograph? Support these Black businesses were cigarette companies and alcohol companies. And there was irony that some of the first places where Black people were able to be seen and to respond and show who they were and how they felt was with these products that are often dangerous for our health. And this ad from 1972, I removed all the advertising information. And this is an ad from 1972 that literally could not have existed in 1967, much less maybe in 1968, because you could not sell a product showing resistance and frustration in Black faces. And that was a sign of the time. And so I started to think about, you can go to the next slide, how you could really track, this corporate idea of Blackness, because most of the ads were made, by white men on Madison Avenue, based off of these assumptions about what Black people wanted. They were all, and I realized that a lot of our culture is a reflection of what corporate America tells us we want. And Billy D. Williams, who's featured here in his Afro Sheen ad for, I guess, a hair relaxer, was one of the most iconic and famous African Americans, Lando Calrissian in Star Wars, and everybody wanted his hair. And there's like something like about the message in this bottle, and I removed all the advertising information again. Something to believe in, because like by softening the texture of your hair, you might be able to kind of assimilate in a way. And just looking at the grooming in that picture to the one before, and seeing how just in 12 years, these different kind of ways of expressing Black beauty and strength change was something I wanted to show. And this is one from 1978 featuring Joe Frazier, heavyweight boxing champion, most famously known for the Thrilla in Manila with Muhammad Ali. And at the time, of the height of his career, he also being from Philadelphia, was, you know, seen as one of the most powerful black men in the country. And Blue Bonnet was doing this campaign where they'd put different people in their blue bonnets and to sell margarine. And there, when I removed all the advertising information, you start to see another subversive message in that they took this kind of symbol of black power and strength, and it echoes, you know, really like the Aunt Jemima and a Mammy image, and that subversiveness is what and something that can be seen as nefarious at times and masked in the advertising is what I was trying to highlight, and why I wanted to do a series that spans so much time.
Mm-hmm.
And this is oh, that's what I was looking for. I was trying to find the original version of this. There's a famous photograph by Ernest Withers, a photographer who was friends with my mom, who passed away. And I remember being in Memphis and my mother introduced me to him. Oftentimes my mother and her friends would introduce me to people and I'd be like, okay, whatever. I'll never forget meeting David Hammonds and someone would be like, that's the most important artist of the 20th century. And we'd be like, that guy? Whatever, you know? And it's amazing how much as a child I was exposed to these brilliant minds and these important moments and historical figures that bore witness to it and made them, that now that I think it came out and through osmosis as I grew older. And this, 1968 was a landmark year, and that's when the photograph of these sanitation workers were holding these signs saying, I am a man. And I was reflecting on that photograph, and I realized that the phrase that I grew up with wasn't I am a man, it was I am the man. And I thought a lot about how under segregation, the Black community could speak with a collective voice and a collective strength and demand action in a different way. Whereas after integration, although there were many opportunities for some, they were not delivered to most. And the fact that in hip hop, as it became popular, commercialized, and in sports as it became commercialized, it became about being the man. Whereas in the 70s, the man was like the one you did not want to be, the one you were working against. And I started thinking about when the U.S. Constitution was written and the laws that are still affecting us today, which included counting African Americans as 3/5 of a human being. I started thinking about all of these different variations of this I am. And so I am the man, am I a man, and am I not a man and a brother? Ain't I a woman? And then I like to read the last line as a poem where it says, I'm the man, who's the man, you the man, what a man, I am man, I'm human, I am many, I am I am a man. Realizing that the greatest gift that any of us is given is our consciousness, because our consciousness is what makes reality. And whatever we say after I am is actually literally creating the way that others and the way that we see and understand ourselves. And so I've become increasingly aware of what I say after I say I am. And I think all of us should, because if we recognize that each of us literally is a blessing, we're only here because someone loved us to this point. And I don't think anyone reaches adulthood without being loved and nurtured, and we take it for granted. So this series is about the individual. It's also about the collective.
What a powerful work. What a powerful work.
Thank you.
Let's have a look at, go to the next slide, perhaps. Cotton Bowl.
Yeah, so
about this?
I was, so in 2011, I did a show called Strange Fruit at the Corcoran Museum, and I was looking a lot at the history of lynching and the legacy of forms of violence on the Black body, and thinking a lot about Gita Board's Society of the Spectacle. and the way that plays out on Black bodies, especially in sports, and thinking about the Ole Miss. Ole Miss is the University of Mississippi football team. It's a really great college football team, and the NCAA is a multi-billion-dollar industry fueled off of the free labor of the descendants of slaves, and often on the same very fields that their ancestors picked cotton, and often to sell products that were made of cotton, sometimes picked by their family members. And I saw a picture of prisoners at Angola State Prison picking cotton, and I realized how much it was like the three-quarter stance in football. And so I made some photographs, really looking at this kind of head-to-head sharecropper, in this case sharecropper, college student relationship. And it's only now that the conversation about paying college athletes is even becoming national discourse, because it was supposed to be about them getting education, whereas in reality they were studying their craft, 50, 60 hours a week, and then expected to have a regular course load while also traveling and also trying to be a human being without also getting any money. And I wanted to highlight that, and it's not lost upon me, at least, that this recent movement towards social justice was inspired by an athlete who took a simple gesture on the field, which is not that different from this one.
Yeah.
And this is the Truth Booth, a collaboration with Ryan Alexiev, who's on the far right there, and Jim Ricks, where it's a modern day confession booth where we invite people to go inside and video record themselves telling the truth from their own perspectives. We've taken it to South Africa, to Ireland, to Afghanistan. Jim just took it to Mexico, and we brought it to about 40 states in the United States and had 10,000 people go inside from across the world to share their truths. And this, I didn't get to go on this specific trip where we brought it to Bamyan in Afghanistan, where the Taliban had recently destroyed a 5,000-year-old Buddhist statue that was carved into the rock. And yet the gesture of bringing this booth there was pretty profound, and also acknowledging that the truth is always contentious. Whose truth are we going to listen to or follow? And that maybe I don't have to discredit your truth in order to validate mine, which is what happened with the destruction by the Taliban of the Bamyan sculpture. And this notion of the truth has only become more and more relevant.
Yeah. If we go to the next slide, this is a photograph. And if we go to the next slide, you mentioned that you were influenced by reading Roland Barthes, by reading the Camera Lucida, and by being fascinated in his essay how there are moments that pierce to the truth and pierce into reality. And this is one sculptural work of you now. And if we go one slide back again to just look at this, using the breathing hole of this, and then basically that's a detail from here to the sculpture. Do you want to say a bit more about the origin of this work?
Sure. Yeah. So this, I think the photographer's name was Catherine Ross, and was taken in around 1990 in Cape Town, South Africa, where people were protesting, much like they are in the streets today, against an unjust and corrupt system that disproportionately affected the disenfranchised and with violent means. And I saw this photograph and was thinking a lot about this idea of the punctum, which is that which sticks with you in the image. I remember when I was reading Camera Lucida, I was like, he's basically saying there's something that's cool in a picture and there's something that's not. It's like, this is not that interesting. And then I saw this image, and I really was pierced, like the way that there's something that stuck with me specifically in these images, and it really is the hands of these people putting their arms through the breathing hole, and this person who puts his arm as they are kind of, pulling off through a steel gate, knowing that the apartheid police were not friendly, and knowing that their arm might get broken, and knowing that often people who were put into these vans were never seen again. And we don't know who this person is or what happened to them, but we do know that they wanted us to have to hear their voice and have a message for us. And the message is Amandla, which in Zulu means power, and was a call, power to the people. And that even when you are, it's really saying fight to your last breath, which is, I think, a really profound thing, that and which metaphor is a metaphor for this moment when so many people have been on the streets at a time when their lives were at risk because of a pandemic, and maybe because their lives were at risk because of pandemic, that they realize how precious every life is, and how the people who are there to protect us are given a really sacred duty. And when they fall short of that, or worse, disrespect their call to duty, it has to be called out and has to be addressed. And it's part of a larger continuum of what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in England, and what's happening in South Africa again, as members of the South African Defense Force killed an unarmed person a few days ago. And so these movements that may take different shapes are global. And another example of that is this.
Yeah, this is based on a photograph. I think an artist is Ernest Cole, and this is based on his photograph of 13 miners being treated like this, being examined, right? Do you want to say about the genesis of this work, and then especially if we go to the next slide and let's keep our view on this one. You want to say a bit about the genesis of this one?
So again, this is rooted in an image from South Africa. There's been over century-long relationship in political discourse between South Africans, especially, and African Americans through the Pan-African Congress from 1924, the first Pan-African Congress. And their struggle on the continent, the struggle on other continents, it is all connected. And this image, I came across this image, the iconic image of Ernest Cole, a Black South African who in a clandestine way took pictures of apartheid that had never been seen, and snuck the film out of the country and exposed the brutality similar to the brutality of the Nazis that Hitler had been able to hide up until 1945. And that changed the way everyone saw segregation in the United States, as well as the institution of apartheid in South Africa. And these miners getting a medical exam by having themselves face the wall and be stripped butt naked with their arms up, really asked what they were looking for, and there's this subtle question was it really them making sure that no one took, because what's crazy, I don't know, I'm digressing a little bit, but it's so insane that little pebbles that are found in the dirt can be more valuable
than the people who found them. And, you know, they're in the diamond mines, and they're like, you can't, a piece this big is worth every ounce of your dignity. And I wanted to really highlight that, and I couldn't do that without actually rethinking it. So I made a sculpture, a punctum sculpture, and I cropped it at their shoulders because I felt I didn't want to expose their bare butts, and I felt like even looking at the image was replicating a form of violence in a sense. And I was thinking about the baptisms that happened in the waters in the South, and the way in which this gesture could both look like you're sinking or arising from something. So I made that piece as a smaller sculpture in 2014 in February, and then in July of 2014, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and the call to action was hands up, don't shoot. And by the time that I first showed this work in the United States in December, its meaning had changed, and I found it so deep that something that happened 50 years ago halfway across the world could speak so eloquently to something that was about to happen here. And I think that's one of the really intrinsic values of art, and art that really tries to reflect and inspire and remind us of social action, is that we do come back to some of these moments and these problems in different ways. And it's important to recognize that the work continues, and that it's never going to be over. Racism and white supremacy isn't going to be over this summer. Even if, you know, the police are defunded and they emancipate people from prisons or whatever the ambitions of people are, it doesn't stop there. And then love overrules. As I looked at advertising, did you want to say something about this one, Klaus?
I love overrules. That's a quote. You want to say a bit about whose quote that is?
Sure. So my cousin Sunga, who was murdered in 2000, about a month after he died, a friend of his said, "Oh yeah, Sunga and I were recording some stuff and messing around, and you know, I thought you might want to hear it." And I was listening to this kind of him kind of playing around on a microphone and singing, and one of the last things he says is love overrules. And after he had passed, I couldn't ask him, did you mean like love overrules? Like we should put love overrules, or that love overrules? And I meditated on that for a long time. And then I was given an opportunity to do a piece in San Francisco. And this is actually a light sculpture that switches. So it'll say love, and it says love rules, and it says love over, then it says overrules, and it'll say love overrules, and then love overrules. And the way in which just those three words can be kind of remixed to have different kind of meanings in subtle ways was something that I wanted to put out in public, because most of the images we see in public are telling us to buy something. And I want us to buy into this idea that love overrules.
If we go back to the slide we talked about in Montgomery for once, because this is at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery in Alabama. If we go now to love overrules, and we go to the next slide, Make America Great Again, you have developed a practice of, when we talked about your fascination of advertising and the impact of advertising. Of course, advertising is often made in a public, like a big billboard in magazines, and you are using both the platforms of advertising and public sculpture in a way. So you are working from within and without the institution. You are doing things like you do here, right, in Pearl in Mississippi, and that was done in 2016. And I remember how provocative this was. And if we go to the next slide, because that was when you took this big billboard and we invited you to take over the first 100 days of Trump's presidency as a residency at the museum. And I remember inviting you, and then MoMA PS1 is a city institution group organization. So it's under the city rules, so to say. And you and I were talking if it is okay that a museum has a political message, if a museum can have an opinion on politics, especially if you're partially funded by the government. And you brought this in. And perhaps we go through these slides. So you see here the big billboard again. And if we hold on a little bit on this one, we see Eric Gottesman, we see you. But what is important that there is the majority leader of the city council, Jimmy Van Bramer, sitting there, and the cultural commissioner of New York City, one under the mayor, Tom Finkelpearl. Do you want to talk a bit about how you worked from Make America Great Again and how you felt recycling this billboard and bringing it back into the museum?
Yeah, so it's all about messaging, right? And in branding, I realized in 2008 that we elected a president that nobody knew anything about, and largely because of his capacity to build a brand and stick with it, selling hope and change, which, if you don't have hope, you're probably dead, and change is inevitable. And I realized the power of empty slogans to kind of shape our world. And our current president is the greatest marketing person of his generation. And saying "Make America Great Again" and as a call to action was not new. Barack Obama said it, George W. Bush said it, Jimmy Carter said it, Ronald Reagan said it, and Bill Clinton said it. And I thought that no one ever asked, when was America more great than it was, say, at that time in 2016, when so many more people were getting opportunities and access to the American dream. And we put this billboard up in Pearl, Mississippi, and people didn't know what to do with it. It was a picture of this Selma to Montgomery March in Alabama for voters' rights, when the police brutalized peaceful protesters, and the world was shocked. And the day was called Bloody Sunday. And I wanted to really encourage us to we as For Freedoms, actually by this time a collaborative, wanted the people to ponder that question. Did America become great when ordinary people stood up and peacefully protested for justice, when the people whose job it was to fight for justice and protect us actually disobeyed their responsibility, and that the love that the nonviolent protesters exhibited in the face of extreme violence of the government is the lesson that I think we are still learning. And so when we knew that something was really powerful, because the governor of Mississippi thought the billboard was racist, and then some black people thought the billboard was racist, then some white people thought it was great, then some black people thought, well, no, this is the problem, and it started all of this really incredible discourse that I remember the headline on CNN, and said, Mississippi residents were unsure about a billboard's intent. The fact that they couldn't put it in a a simple category of being pro this or anti this, is why it was art. Because I believe great art asks questions, and putting these questions in public in the form of billboards is amazing. That because most of the time we see these questions, they're in museums, and so we thought it'd be incredible to take this object that was out in the world and caused so much attention and discourse and put it inside the museum as an artifact was an amazing opportunity, and only you, Klaus, would have given us the opportunity just to do that, literally kind of on a whim.
I think it's always a museum is always the staff and the board doing that together, and that was, we had to clarify a lot of responsibilities. And I know you and Eric and I were on the phone all the time, what we were allowed to do and what not. And because we also made posters and we made signs and we made a call center and all of these things. And there was a very fine line. What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? But I think you and I had conversations about artists that claim that all art is political and all art has to be political and of service. And I really cherish this collaboration on a whim. Yes, we did that immediately because we didn't know what the outcome of the election was, and we did it within like weeks. And you pulled off with all your colleague artists and all your colleague activists an incredible program for 100 days. It was really, really well attended. You see all those posters and messages. And perhaps in the slideshow, we should go to the next 3 big billboards.
I'd ask you a question though. I'm curious though, what you don't really ever talk about how your background and your education affects the choices that you made as a museum director, and especially choices such as this.
I was in primary school. School system is a little bit different. So I was like 9 or 10 or so. And I had a school teacher who at his day job was to teach us, but his real ambition was to be a masterclass student with Joseph Beuys. And Joseph Beuys was teaching civil disobedience, civil courage. He sat down on a highway. He admitted all the students that wanted to admit, and then he was fired as the dean of the art academy in Düsseldorf. And it was national news that this famous artist had been escorted with the police out of the academy in front of the running cameras. And Joseph Beuys basically claimed that everybody is creative and everybody's therefore has the creative powers to be responsible for whatever happens, and all of your actions are political. So I grew up as a 9 or 10-year-old thinking art is political, art is performative, and art has to take responsibility. So that's a background that for me as a 9 or 10-year-old, I didn't understand that not all art was that immediately. I remember then years later learning about painting and sculpture and learning about autonomous art, more art that is about art. And I have to say, it was incredible. For me, this is always important as a statement for art education, because if I hadn't been this influence of an art teacher who at the same time was also an art student with another artist. So for me, when we did this was a little bit going back to the moment that made me become a curator, I think.
Wow, so you carry that memory with you.
Yeah. I think it speaks for inspiration and motivation. You can never underestimate what a child sees and a child hears. I think part of this school teacher is the reason why I became a curator and a museum person.
Awesome. Do they know that, or?
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I just think, and also, but you also left the country. That's it. So I was just curious how coming from Germany, also, being, I guess, a generation or two removed from the war, and coming to the United States in the 80s. Did you come in the 80s or 90s?
90s. I started in the early 90s. I started by default, by accident, an institution in Berlin as an intern. And I made the institution speak English. That was kind of so, and I had just finished working as a young German, you can work for atonement. You can go to Israel for a while and work there. And I worked there for a summer after school. So I think that all of these things influence how we go forward in our life. And for me, the work in Israel in the atonement was important. For me, being in East Berlin at a moment where the wall, just after the wall fell, was important for me. But I think it's a studio visit with you, Hank. I don't want to monopolize
well,
the boring life of a curator.
I think it's a studio visit with you. People came here because you invited them and said I was going to be here. And I've known you for, I said, almost 20 years. And I haven't heard these stories, and I'm not sure if other people have. And I think that it's the reason I say that is because it's also the personal stories of the presenters. My mother being a curator, my wife being a curator. I often feel that it's overlooked that, you know, who does the choosing and what value and the importance that is. You know, Larry, who's on the call, has done a lot to try to elevate that conversation.
Yeah.
And it's just critical for us always to be aware of who is presenting work and what are their inflection points, what's bringing them to want to care about those things. And you obviously have a very diverse interest. I just noticed that a lot of it does come back to some form of disobedience in play and also civic engagement.
Joseph Beuys coins a word that I carry with me since I'm a child. And it was, in German, it says soziale Plastik. And you could possibly only translate it as social sculpture. And I think what you are doing is very close to what he was envisioning that could be. So soziale Plastik is putting a billboard with "Make America Great Again" in Missouri. That is soziale Plastik. That is social sculpture in a way that you engage on a larger than just art level. You engage as an entry point. You engage outside of the protective gallery system that declares it as art and leaves it as a question. And if we go to your billboards here, I think this is what I think is social sculpture, that we can go perhaps also to the next slide. If we can, just us here, and then one more. I think this is what I think soziale Plastik is. This is what you're doing, Hank. And for me, it wasn't much of a question that we will do what we did in 2017, just a couple of weeks later. And we have continued this when you then went to, perhaps we go to the next one. We did this here at the Geffen, where Jenny Holzer, perhaps the next, did this amazing.
2018.
Yeah, that was then in 18. So I think you going beyond, and perhaps you say a bit about this. This is like, here's a cover of New York Magazine, which is incredible. And perhaps we keep it here for a little bit on this picture, because for me, art anticipates reality. Art is activist, but also art creates revealing images in a way. Do you want to say a bit how that felt, that this work of yours was the cover of New York Magazine?
Yeah, and I think I didn't get to talk that much about Four Freedoms actually in this case. So I'll say that the billboard that we saw, and both billboards were part of a collaboration that Eric Gottesman, Michelle Wu, Wyatt Gallery, and I started, called Four Freedoms, as a super PAC with also Joanna Bellarado Samuels. And the goal was to put political discourse in critical discourse into political discourse through fine art thinking, which is, I guess, very Boysian and inspiration. And this idea of using political speech and asking artists like Emily Hanako Momohara and Sanford Biggers to make political speech through their art practice was something that hasn't been done enough, and definitely not done in a huge scale. And so we did this 50 state initiative where we did exhibitions, town halls, and billboards in all 50 states as For Freedom's 50 state initiative. And one of the activations was the Jenny Holzer vote bus in collaboration with Summit. And that was a town hall at the St. Louis Museum of Contemporary Art. And All Lives Matter was one of my billboards. It also was on New York Magazine. And it really came in response to the counter argument to Black Lives Matter, which was all lives matter. And as if Black lives weren't part of all lives, and so that Black lives were being disproportionately harmed, that it somehow should be drowned out that other lives were not. And I heard someone on the radio say that all lives matter, but some more than others. And I realized as I looked, it was like lives. Oh, yeah, all lives matter, because those who are saying all lives matter are using it to deceive people from the truth, which is that they don't really care about all lives. And that I actually continue to see this piece go up different places. And just this week, for context, or when people see it later, the city of DC, Washington, DC, where I went to high school, painted Black Lives Matter on, I believe it's Pennsylvania Avenue, in huge yellow letters. And for a city, especially a majority Black city that's being gentrified, to paint that on the street is, and it being the capital of the United States, is pretty profound. And how a simple gesture, which is saying Black Lives Matter, which is, should not need to be said, can become a global call to action, says a lot about how far we have to go.
Yeah. This is a sculpture you have at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge on the Brooklyn side. And this is a photograph that is very rarely that empty around there. Let's go for the next photograph. And you were kind enough to yesterday provide us with a video. Did you shoot the video yourself? Did you take the video yourself?
No, my friend Micah Bozeman shot it.
Because I remember you and I were talking and you said, oh, I'm on my way to New York. Mm-hmm. And so let's perhaps play this. Oops, sorry, I hope so. We have the sound on.
Hands up, don't shoot. 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 Hands up.
So if we go one slide back, want to say a bit about this work and of course the situation and of course the moment that this photo was taken?
Yeah, so this was taken just a couple days ago, and the arm is a 22-foot sculpture of the arm of an African immigrant by the name of Joel Embiid, who is a center for the Philadelphia 76ers basketball team. And I wanted, when given the opportunity by Tom Finkelpearl, to make a permanent public sculpture for the city of New York. I wanted to make one that reminded us about the importance of brown bodies and immigrant bodies in making this nation, it's right next to the United States District Court, and it's and the old post office building and the Brooklyn Bridge. And I wanted to make a symbol that spoke to, there was a call to action. So I titled it Unity, and it's this arm pointing to the sky with one finger, and, you know, one nation, one people, one planet, one universe. And I had dreamed that when there was a place that was needed for people to gather and make statements that, you know, at this intersection, that I could make a piece that would function in that way. So the city gave me an opportunity in this time to give people a place to express their frustration and yell out in one voice a critical thing that should never have to be said, which is hands up, don't shoot. And that you see people from a broad range of ethnicities and generations making this statement, and this gesture is really powerful. And it, as you saw earlier, it connects to different work from before, all related to the death of Mike Brown in 2014. So this young man who died unjustly is still shaping our understanding of how we can make America great.
Mm-hmm. If we go, I want to still have, in the interest of time, the recording is normally an hour. And I would love to have a chance to talk about For Freedoms and the collective, and of course also what you're working on and what you're doing right now. Let's not go that fast, but perhaps. So we have this and the next, just want to pay respect to your last show you had here in Los Angeles, and the next one.
And shout out to Sarah Watson, who helped me with putting this show together at Kane Griffin Corcoran. It was really looking at the color line as it came to Hollywood, and how Black bodies were often misrepresented in the black and white era of filmmaking, which ironically was also largely segregated. And then thinking about how color theory could be a metaphor for the challenges that people were facing in trying to fight segregation in media and popular culture throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, and if we go to the next. And this was a big outdoor sculpture at your recent show. It was really very powerful exhibition. Do you want to say a bit about this object, and then we go to the, For Freedoms?
Sure. Well, my aunts and cousins on this call will remember that one of my favorite toys was this General Lee car, which was a replica toy of the car from the Dukes of Hazzard, a TV show about some good old boys who didn't mean any harm, and they would be rebel rousing. And it was a really popular television show, and everyone, boy in my generation in the United States, loved it, including Black boys. And none of our parents took the time to tell us the problematics of what it meant for Black children to be playing with a car that had the Confederate flag on it. And so I only learned later the legacy of General Lee and of that symbol. And one of the things the car did every show was, I guess, it did a jump. Yeah, it was like a flying car, which is what made it so exciting. And the car, in reality, the car usually crashed when it landed. So there's all of these pictures, and they continue to do these car jumping contests with this specific generation of the Dodge Charger. And I wanted to highlight kind of that moment in the midst of a crash of this kind of symbol. And this week, after just a few months after Kehinde Wiley debuted his sculpture Rumors of War at the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art, and after the calls to action after the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, the governor of Virginia who previously was in the headlines for having worn blackface, is the one who chose to remove the General Lee sculpture from Richmond. And in a way so this week is when the Civil War finally has ended. Because it would have been equivalent to having statues of Nazis up still in Germany. And so, yeah, so I'm still kind of in shock that this sculpture was put up and about this movement coming to a screeching halt. And now, I don't know. I'm in a moment of suspended disbelief. And that's what the sculpture is about. So
Yeah.
I guess we can go to the next slide.
So you were when we started working in 2017 for your residency, For Freedoms is a super PAC that is not partisan. And you have For Freedoms as a collective that you and Eric and others are basically, it's an artistic practice, but it's also an instrument you can play in addition to being a solo artist in a way. And you do these very important works here based on the rock world. You have freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom from want, freedom from fear. You re-stage these important. And if we go one slide further, so you did these town halls for Freedom Congress at the Hammer one day and also 2 days here at MOCA at One Mies Warehouse programs. And sorry for the not so good image quality of this one here, but that's a photograph I took. You had like, can't believe that this is the last big event I went to before social distancing, but you had like 500 people attending at the warehouse, and there were different classes and different seminars around it. And if we go to the next one, this was such an important For Freedoms, a visionary Congress.
Not reactionary, yeah.
You want to say a bit more about this,
Yeah,
Hank?
so we realized that the United States Constitution was written in a collaborative way, and that there were these congresses that were brought together before the Declaration of Independence was actually signed, and that the creatives should be the ones imagining and building and designing our future, where we currently have decidedly non-creative people writing the laws that dictate and shape our lives. And we have these institutions that don't really, that where all of these incredible ideas are generated, that don't really ever leave these institutions. And if they do, they take 30 or 40 years, like multiculturalism and, you know, the women's rights movement and LGBTQAI stories that have been told for generations in the art world that are just coming to the surface in general discourse and being dumbed down. And we think that artists should be civic leaders, and that arts institutions are civic institutions. They are literally the future imagination hubs. And so we called together the Congress, where we brought 2 delegates from all 50 states, plus DC and Puerto Rico, from museums, from the streets, from galleries and colleges and universities, to have discourse and do programming around what it means to be civically engaged in an election year. And it's just so awesome to see how we arrived in this place from all over, and how different artists from different indigenous communities were able to connect in different ways, and immigrant communities, and all of the intersections that happened, and how we could all coexist and learn from one another in such a productive and joyous way, because art can bring people together in a way that to open their minds in a way that nothing else can. And so that's why we're so grateful, because we realize that, you know, the work that you all do, the work that Annie Philbin does, the work that is done at USC and all over LA has kind of been the work that went out throughout the world, you know, to obviously shape our imagination. LA is it's the center of our fantasy, of our psychology, and thank you all for giving us that space again, dangerously generously.
And only thank you for, now it's 3 years that we have been collaborating on, from the residency to this. So I can only thank you for doing this, and with all your artist collaborators and everybody else. This was such an important moment, and you cannot believe that we are all together. And then after we took this picture, or it was the next day, because this was a multi-day program, you gave us all these beautiful cloaks, and I remember we were wearing them, and we were like doing this incredibly big group hug. It was like as many people as, even more, because it was the last day and it was more full. Must have been like at least 200 people doing a group hug, and you had a drone flying over us. First I thought like we were being observed or something. I didn't know it was your drone. First I was like, so we had this drone flying over us, and we did this group hug. And that was just days before we all went into isolation, and that was literally days. And I thank you for having stayed in contact through these last 3 months continuously. And so if we go to the next slide, just during this contact, of course, you made this incredibly important project here. We have a board member here at MOCA, Karen Cole, who is producing, to benefit the museum, these masks. But of course, wearing a mask is, of course, also the mutual respect that you are protecting everybody else and yourself. And you made this side up live handle with care. And I think you and I were texting the image 2 weeks ago or so. And now looking at this image, it already looks so very, very different in a way. Do you want to talk a bit about this? Because I think it's just so important.
Well, there's just so many, there are going to be poets that write and speak about this moment in ways that I don't think I can yet. There is a horrific, scary poetry that's a metaphor for all that's been happening, that, you know, the planet has been choking because of carbon dioxide, CO2, and all of our kind of misuse of our resources, and our desire to travel, to make connections, has also become something that carries with us, as we saw before, you know, viruses that can threaten the lives of many people. And this current coronavirus, which attacks our lungs, the essence of life that allows us to breathe, is something that is so heavy. And having, cousins like my cousin Edward Lathan, who is a doctor and a frontliner, who was in New Rochelle when the pandemic first hit there, and the stories, of seeing people, literally suffocate to death was, so impactful. And then going into our reflection, we went from like mania, basically, as normal life, to deep frozen reflection in a way that no one would have ever imagined that the world could pause, and thinking about the value of our lives and of our relationships, and the value of every breath, sometimes counting every breath, just, I hope I'm not sick, to then watching the police literally crush someone to death who was screaming, "I can't breathe," and calling out for his mother, who's no longer on the planet. And I often think that officer's neck was not just on George Floyd's neck, it was on the neck of so many people in the United States of America who, like him, didn't have job, didn't have a basic income or resource to protect his life and his family, and are finding alternate ways to just get by and put into even more precarious situations. And so I think we are now all more mindful about our own breath. So when we wear the mask, as you said, we're wearing it for ourselves, but also for others. And then mindful of the fragility of life, and the need to treat every life the same way that we handle a great work of art.
Thank you, Hank. We looked at nearly 20 years of work of yours, and at some point in the studio visit, you mentioned that something that you found from 50 years ago, 40 years ago, it was 40 years ago, all of a sudden had a different meaning for you. You said 1968 and 2008. For me, I can only thank you for this incredibly thoughtful visit. And you emailed me this design, and I think it might have been on a Friday. And I looked at it again on the Monday, and it looked like a completely different mask. And I can only thank you for this incredibly thoughtful studio visit and for all the incredible works you shared with us, and you were thinking behind how you make a work, but also what's the purpose and the intention and the environment of these works is from your single practice to the collective practice. It really means a lot. Thank you, Hank. That was
Thank you.